Great. And Scott, why don't you go ahead with the introduction?
Sounds good. So today I'm excited to introduce Anna Karion, who is in the greater Baltimore, DC area and is doing really interesting work on Baltimore. Anna is currently a scientist at the NIST offices in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Anna did her PhD at Caltech, if I'm remembering that correctly. And after that was a scientist at the NOAA Global Monitoring Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado for a while, and then moved to NIST where she's been for several years now. So I'll turn it over to Anna to talk about some of the greenhouse gas work that they've been doing in the Baltimore, DC area.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. So thanks, folks, for inviting me and Ben and Scott to give this talk. I have been to some of the BSEC meetings, a couple of the kickoff meetings, but it's always good to make sure that we're in touch and communicating and collaborating about what we're doing since we're working in the same area. Yeah, I guess as Scott said, I'll give an overview of what NIST is working on in urban greenhouse gases in general and dive in a little bit more on the our project covers Washington, D.C. and Baltimore both, but so I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I have a million logos because a lot of different people work on these different NIST urban test beds. We have a fairly small group actually at NIST, which is the names listed here, but we work extensively with a lot of different partners. Okay. I guess this is just to give you an overview. I am going to talk a little bit, explain what NIST is because that's not always something people know, and then go into the urban greenhouse gas monitoring. So NIST is a federal science agency. We're inside the Department of Commerce, but it's the U.S. National Metrology Institute, metrology being the science of measurement. So there's an international community where every country has their own NMI, National Metrology Institute, and we're all under the umbrella of the BIPM, which is in France. And if you recall from history, the BIPM there was a convention where everybody agreed to work with the international system of units, and they defined the meter and the kilogram. So NIST was the US representative there. So we have, we had the meter and the kilogram, and they've now redefined all of these units. We have a little logo there. But essentially that's kind of one of the core missions. NIST also has a secondary piece that's not like all the metrology institutes, where we do a lot of basics in addition to standards and standardization, standard methods. First, there's a key role in sort of transfer to private industry. We're supposed to be supporting the private sector in terms of promoting innovation and competitiveness. We advance standards. The standards are being used by the private sector, and we sort of facilitate that. But there's also a little bit of a basic research piece to NIST where there's a focus on actual measurement methods, and there are a lot of cutting edge research being done in various fields, mostly chemistry and physics. And we have multiple Nobel Prize winners. We're mostly in Gaithersburg and in Boulder are the two sort of main NIST locations. So within greenhouse gases, again, the greenhouse gas measurement program is focusing on measurements and standards, and the objective is to advance these measurement methods for greenhouse gas emissions data. And specifically, I list the different program sort of components there. There's different parts of it that happen within NIST. Some of it is coming up with new ways to measure greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's been a lot of sort of cutting edge work on cavity ring down, dual comb spectroscopy, LIDAR, things like that. Calibration, a lot of Earth observing satellite instruments are calibrated by NIST or traceable to NIST standards on radiometry and things like that. But I'm in this urban greenhouse gas measurement system, so that's what I'll talk about. This is my history of greenhouse gas monitoring. Everybody knows that, NOAA and Scripps are measuring CO2 throughout the globe in the atmosphere, and that's how we know, we track very closely how it's increasing and the seasonal cycles, et cetera. So these are kind of these global informed measurements, but there's also a more recent history of urban scale measurements in greenhouse gases, and urban populations contribute a huge fraction to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. There's also a lot of activity going on now in cities Baltimore being one of them, but a lot of cities are interested in, they have their own reduction plans for carbon and CO2 and methane. So there's kind of a demand for actionable information to understand how their policies are being effective, whether their policies are being effective, and atmospheric measurements can be valuable in constraining this emissions information. So on the right, I have a map of some, probably not all the networks of in different urban areas where people are measuring, have a dense network of greenhouse gases. There's also a lot of air quality intertwined here, just as in your project. A lot of the GHG and air quality measurements kind of go on together. The red squares are kind of where NIST is doing their, where we have our 3 test beds, we call them, which I'll talk about in a second. These are also the arrows. So a few years ago, Logan Mitchell at University of Utah put some of the data from all these different cities together, and I put them on a repository, and we participated in that. So the 3, the Indianapolis Tower Network, which is run by Penn State, Ken Davis, who's on the call, and the LA Network, which and the Washington, DC and Baltimore network. So this kind of shows through time how the different networks started and what the CO2 looks like in different parts, but that's kind of just to show the time series of the different stations. The NIST test beds specifically are these 3 that I've mentioned. We started out with the influx experiment in Indianapolis, followed by the LA Megacities project, which is not just Los Angeles, it's kind of Southern California coast air basin. And then the latest one, which we call the Northeast Corridor, we start with Baltimore and Washington, but it's a little bit, there's kind of an urban network. I'll show that in a minute, so I'm not going to talk about it now. But the goal here is that these are collaborative projects where we have multiple institutions working to bringing different kinds of measurements, combining measurements and different analysis methods. So Indianapolis being an example, you know, we have aircraft measurements that happen, and this is probably in all the test beds. You can do a mass balance experiment. You could do atmospheric inversions, meteorological modeling, whatnot. And in addition to bottom up estimates from activity data and see how well they match. And that's kind of the NIST part, which is kind of to demonstrate the methods. Do you get the same result if you do something 3 or 4 different ways? Here I'm focusing on the tower networks, showing the maps of the 3. These are in situ networks, in situ towers measuring CO2, methane, and often CO, but not always. But like I said, it's not just towers. On the right is the Northeast Corridor map. The points, you can see the towers throughout the Northeast, but there's this dense network in DC. And this is actually an outdated map. Now that I look at it, we do have more sites than that. A couple more in New Jersey, actually. So if anybody's interested in those, I should add them. But okay, so the Northeast project is the project that I work on. And I think I already said all this. This is again the map. Oh, this has one of the New Jersey sites, but the idea is that we instrument these cell towers. This is all through partnership with a private company, Earth Network. So again, I mentioned that NIST has a bit of a goal in terms of transferring things to the private sector. And we think that these kinds of measurements could be made more operational through, you know, in a private sector kind of framework. So that's what we've been working on. But we collaborate a lot with Scripps, especially on the Los Angeles network, because theirs is also with Earth Networks, and then with Indianapolis. So I think I mentioned most of this stuff. We do have plans to be instrumenting along the Northeast Corridor, not just DC and Baltimore. We have a lot of non-urban sites, as you can see here, because the idea is to be able to characterize the surrounding area and the whole kind of region, and you need background stations for that. We also have whole air flask samples collected and shipped to NOAA GML for additional analysis of other gases. So even though we're mostly only measuring CO2, methane, and CO, there are other species that can be done from the flasks, but there's a couple of flask locations in Indianapolis and 4 in Washington, DC, but actually 1 in Baltimore, 1 in Washington. I'm wrong. 2 in Baltimore, 1 in Washington, 1 outside Washington, DC, and 1 background site. Oh, here it is. And I have that location of those flasks. So this is kind of the first zoom in you're seeing. I think in the next slide, yeah, for this group, I kind of pulled out what the Baltimore site specifically. And I know that you all are putting instrumentation at some of these places, especially what we call the Northeast Baltimore site, which is on the corner of Clifton Park. And Ken and Scott can verify exactly what's going to go there from you guys, from your project, but that's one of our network stations. It's also one of the stations that does collect the NOAA flasks, so that's kind of something just to keep in mind. They don't happen very often. It's 6 times a month. Sorry, 6 samples per month, but I would argue it's actually a lot less than that. We're trying to increase that frequency to 6 times a month because it hasn't quite been that due to various logistical constraints. So yeah, that's where we are. So I talked about the towers. There's a lot of other work going on that I should mention. So aircraft campaigns, University of Maryland and Stony Brook through Russ Dickerson's team and Paul Shepson's group are doing a lot of aircraft campaigns throughout the Northeast, measurements. So campaigns, but actually over, they'll do like 2 weeks of flights every year in February and then a couple weeks in the summer. So it's campaign mode, but it's also monitoring, and that they routinely make these flights year after year. And it's been years now. They've started probably in 2015, 2016. I'll show some results from that. I mentioned the tower network already and the flasks. There's this other component, which we call emissions modeling, but this would be like a bottom-up model of CO2 emissions and methane emissions. So Northern Arizona University, Kevin Gurney's group has been developing the Hestia product, which is linked with his Vulcan product, but it's more tailored to specific cities and it gets a lot of city-specific information. And we do have that for Baltimore. They did a version, and there's some papers through 2015, but we're expecting an update through sort of at least 2021, 2022 soon, any day now, I am told. But that's what that can look like. And we're also collaborating with NOAA CSL on this. They have this inventory product called Grapes. They're going to be releasing CO2. And this is continental, so it's not really just urban, but it's something where they're interested in making sure that the urban emissions match our data. So we're kind of working with them. We here at NIST do a lot, as well as our collaborators, but that's one thing that we've been doing is a lot of atmospheric modeling. So we tend to model these towers and aircraft flights and do atmospheric inversions. And lastly, there is what we call a biosphere testbed. So at NIST, we've been running VPRM, which is a very simple biosphere model. There's also a forest on site that we're using as like a small test bed where there's a project going with Lucy Hutira's group at BU to measure SIF as well as different properties of individual trees and kind of try to link uptake with SIF at different scales, so at these smaller scales. Okay, so I mentioned airborne sampling, and I'm not going to talk a huge amount about this. This is showing New York City, but similar work has been going on in DC, where they periodically, as I mentioned, fly over. This was from a paper that recently came out about New York City. They measure different things. Sometimes there's different kinds of analyses that go on the same data set. Israel Lopez Coto, my colleague, I think later I'll show a result from him, has been actually doing inversions using this data. So that's something relatively new, and he's interested in continuing doing as these flights continue. Okay, so now I jump back as to how are we doing these estimates. Mention this stuff again before, sorry. I've already mentioned bottom up and top down. I'm assuming a lot of people in this group are familiar with this, but go over it just in case. Bottom up is the idea of the inventory. So I talked about the Hestia model. So this is the kind of model that would start with like methods that the EPA does for their national reporting, but you estimate, the number of buildings, the fuel sales, et cetera. You have an emission factor. What are the emissions per building, or what are the emissions per car? And you come up with an estimate of the emissions, and that can be spatially and temporally disaggregated. It's not always, but in the case of something like Hestia, it can be. And from the top down, as I mentioned, we have these towers, you have aircraft, and they're measuring the GHGs in the atmosphere. I should add a little satellite there. We haven't so far worked a lot with satellite data, but that's definitely something we're looking at getting into. The wind is transporting these fluxes. I look at them as they coming in a grid, and then you have these emissions going and you sampling them from your tower or your aircraft. So you need to understand the transport in order to link these two. And that's what's actually really important. No matter how simple your model, you can call a mass balance model. You can just measure the wind and say, well, it must have been this much, but that's still kind of a simple model. A more sophisticated model looks like this, which is an atmospheric inversion. You could start with a prior, or you don't have to, but you transport the fluxes forward, like I showed in that movie, using a meteorological transport model, and then you end up with some simulated observations like I'm showing at the top. I don't think my mouse is showing here, but you could basically say, like, if these were the emissions, what would I expect to see at my tower? And then you can compare with your actual observations. Well, what am I actually seeing at my tower? And then you can do various kinds of statistical analyses to compare these two and optimize the emissions in order to fit your data better. So you end up with what we call the posterior. So that's your basic flux inversion system. Actually, I know Jocelyn is on the call, so I just wanted to say thank you, Jocelyn. This is your graphic of the very old computer on the slide. Of course, these models make a whole bunch of assumptions, and you can run them a lot of different ways. You have different kinds of transport models, error associated with how you estimate your background coming into the domain, etc. So we take that all into account. In any case, because these are not definite methods, you can't just measure the methane and say, yes, this is your methane emissions. The NIST goal is to kind of improve the measurements for both the top-down and the bottom-up methods and assess their uncertainties by comparing different methods. It's one of the main ways to look at uncertainty, is to see how the different methods compare, but also other ways of assessing what we think the uncertainties are with any of these estimates. Okay, so going back to the aircraft measurements, this is just an example of an inversion that Israel Lopez Cotto did and published a couple of years ago now in ES&T. This was actually for carbon monoxide, and you can see on the left the map of the DC Baltimore area. He estimated the total emissions for both urban areas. The red splotches there are the census designated urban areas, and that was what he chose to be his domain. These flux inversions, although they might estimate the emissions at a 1 kilometer level, we don't necessarily trust any one pixel of that 1 kilometer grid emissions. There would be a lot of uncertainty associated with it. So by aggregating in time and space, we have smaller uncertainties on those averages, on those totals. In this case, he quantified CO emissions over several years, 6 years. Like I mentioned, these campaigns occurred through time. So starting in 2015 through 2020, he looked at the average CO emission rate, which I'm showing here on the right, which was in black. And he determined that, especially if you exclude 2015, there's a pretty, there's a robust trend, downward trend. And it turns out that that trend matched the trend in the bottom-up emissions, which is the red. I believe that is from the National Emissions Inventory from the EPA. There is some massaging, like they don't, you have to, if they report sort of an annual number, and you have to figure out what it would have been during the day, because these measurements are made during the day, and CO emissions have a huge diurnal cycle, as you could guess. So in order to try to compare apples and apples, so that's not directly from the NEI, but it's basically based on the NEI, but that there is this downward trend. So that was able to be seen from the top down, even though the top down measurements are significantly lower than the NEI, which has been shown in other papers. He also was able to quantify the decreased CO emissions due to the COVID lockdowns in April and May of 2020. And those were also similar to what one would have expected if he went back and looked at traffic data and sort of estimated what you would expect to see. And that matched pretty well with what he thought he saw. So that was a really nice example of how airborne campaigns, and not just towers, can also give you temporal information. But you do have to have a lot of flights over many years, but it is an effective tool for trend detection if you have enough flights, I guess. So next couple studies I'm going to show are examples of recent work using the towers that I talked about. This was a paper that came out of I guess in 2021, where we looked at, we worked together with Vineet Yadav at JPL, who works in the LA Megacities project. So on the left, I'm showing the LA network, on the right, the DC Baltimore network. And we did CO2 inversions for carbon dioxide from January to May of multiple years to look at how the 2020 year varied based on the lockdowns from COVID. And the main thing I learned from this project was that the emissions vary from year to year, and here much more so than in LA. We found that in LA there wasn't that much interannual variability in the emissions, but in this area, because we're in the middle of transitioning from coal to using more natural gas, and the amount of that really varies based on weather and various other things, we had a lot of interannual variability that was not related to COVID, but basically we were trying to analyze our results and say, like, how is this different from a typical year? And then in the process of that, we discovered that there's really no typical year that, so on the right, I'm kind of just showing when we pulled different activity data, total power plant emissions, which are reported for different years. So the different bars are different years for a given month. So January, on the upper left, January, power plant emissions, gray was 2015, light blue is 2018, 2019, 2020. So you can see what massive variability there was through the years in just the power plant emissions between the different years. And then same with, we looked at the state of Maryland gas consumption. Again, not as different from year to year, but definitely different from year to year. Notably, in March, actually of 2020, which is in red, we used less gas in Maryland because it was warmer that year. And so that was something that was separate from the COVID effect. And it was just because of a warmer weather that people weren't using their heat. In the motor vehicle fuel sales, you can definitely see that in April of 2020, you see that lower amount in 2020, the lower red bar. But again, there's a lot of variability. And then on the bottom, we kind of decided, like, how would you adjust? We had Vulcan for 2015. So we were trying to adjust it based on these different activities and kind of figure out how much of the decline, how much of what we were seeing from the atmosphere was based on these different components, or might have been. So yeah, I have that. Motor vehicle fuel sales are the ones that show that specifically. In any case, we did see this decline in the atmospheric data. So the blue bars show how much we thought that the emissions declined relative to the mean of the 2 previous years in both March, and then in April. But, and then the gray bars are kind of our estimate of like an activity-based bottom-up adjustment, like how much would we think it should change? And then on the right is for DC and Baltimore, showing that, in March, we did see lower emissions to the 2 previous years, but the dark gray bar says most of that was, could be explained by that bottom-up analysis I just showed. The gasoline sales only explain a little bit of the decline, but in April, the gasoline sales, which is the lighter gray, show really most of the decline can be attributed to the gasoline sales. In any case, it was a really interesting activity to go through. Because to me, it kind of emphasized that there's a lot of variability here in Washington and Baltimore from year to year in CO2 emissions. Okay, so I think the most recent paper followed similar methods as before, but now did the inversion for methane using the tower data. And this just came out last December, but we looked at the methane emissions for these 2 urban areas. So we started with, I'll show a little bit more. We actually created our own prior emissions inventory because we didn't have a highly resolved, this is a 1 kilometer grid I'm showing on the right. And this is actually our final emissions for Baltimore and Washington. But I'm going to get into a little bit more. On the left here, I'm showing the locations of the towers, which you've seen now multiple times. We have these background towers, and this time we estimated emissions separately for DC and Baltimore, but again, using those census urban area qualifications, because when you look at the city of Baltimore in the dark blue, it's quite small. And I'll show what that looked like, but we didn't really include it in the paper because we have really large uncertainties when we try to quantify it for such a small area. In any case, we did that. So we were able to kind of compare the 2, although we found, I'll get into it in a minute, but the reasons. So first we constructed this prior, and I just wanted to mention this. I know, Scott, you've been doing a lot of work with methane, with Dylan, and on the methane emissions from Baltimore. So this was, my goal, the goal here was to make a prior, not to necessarily get the magnitude of the emissions correct. So we focused on getting the activity data in order to distribute the fluxes in space properly, but the emission factors, which actually give you the magnitude of the emissions, I'm not sure I trusted them a huge amount. But one thing I'll say, and this is kind of how we did each sector that I don't need to go into, we definitely relied on a lot of EPA data. But what I did want to mention at the top here was that Joe Pitt from Stony Brook, and who's now at Bristol, created a inventory for New York City, but with sort of more robust methods, and is, I think, going to be making like the code. He definitely has made the inventory public, but that there's a project going on now, sort of a follow-on project at Stony Brook, where they're going to try to do this for the whole Northeast. So, and kind of release code so you can put in different scenarios, like, do you want to use the wetlands from wet charts, or do you want to use this other wetland emission factor? And that you could kind of have a couple different versions of a prior that you could have at 1 kilometer in the northeastern US, and maybe even for CONUS, but I have a feeling that'll be a ways out. For now, he's working on different cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, et cetera, and trying to get these different sectors. So it's not going to be focusing on the oil and gas production regions. It's definitely focusing on these urban sectors, gas distribution, landfills, et cetera. But we used a version of this as our prior, and then along here, I'm just showing the average methane mole fractions at our different towers. That's in black. This just to show that the background that we used, I used 2 different backgrounds, but you can't really see the purple because they're very similar, but the red line is showing the background. So that's the methane concentration coming into the domain, whereas black is so the difference is on the bottom plot. So that's really what we're running the inversion on. But just to show that the background is very variable and is really important to get right. You certainly can't assume some sort of constant background. It's very extremely variable. So just because, again, this was focused on Baltimore, we asked Dylan and Scott for the city inventory, which helped a lot because a lot of times the published inventories they're a little hard to compare because we're estimating a scope 1 product, which is the emissions that are geographically bounded by the domain and not necessarily due to things upstream. And a lot of cities, and even the state of Maryland, are estimating their emissions, including emissions sort of that happen outside the city itself. And that could be a landfill that's not in the city, or it could be electricity, importing electricity or whatever. But sometimes they're also not even separated by CO2 versus methane. So again, because we were able to work with them in their spreadsheet, I was able to try to compare apples to apples. And that's what we got on the left here, which is that our results for the city are in blue with these pretty wide error bars, as I mentioned, because we don't, there's a lot of uncertainty around the estimate for just that small domain in the city. But overall, not bad. Pretty close, and actually a little bit lower than the city inventory. On the right, I'm just showing the comparison with another paper that was out in 2019 from Jenny Plant from Eric Kort's group, where they used flights to estimate sort of snapshot emissions across different cities. And again, I was able to work with Jenny to get her exact domain. I mean, again, this was another exercise in realizing, like, comparing 2 numbers is not that straightforward. A lot of times you can't just work with the number that was published in the paper, because it turns out her numbers were in blue for each. She also used the census designated urban areas, so you would think they would be the same. But it depends on how you grid that and whether you include the grid cells on the boundary. She had a 0.1 degree grid. We had a 0.01 degree grid. She was using like a different kind of filter. So when I looked at my results, they were the light orange for the 2 urban areas. But when she sent me her actual mask of the grid, spatial grid that she was using, I got the light, sort of the brownish color, which of course matched her color better, because essentially she was just using a bigger area. So if you're looking at kilograms per, which was the unit that they published, I needed to be able to compare those apples to apples. So again, it matches previous work. It seems to be a little bit lower than some of the previous work. Our estimates were a little bit lower, but definitely within uncertainties. The main thing that we found is that when we looked at the long-term observations, sort of the long-term emission rates that we got from our top-down analysis here on the left, we saw a very clean seasonal cycle. The blue line is a 3-month smoother. So the the circles are actually the monthly mean. So it's a lot cleaner once you smooth it. You can really pull out that pattern. And we saw that in the winter time, the emissions were higher than in the summer in these areas, in these downtown cores. A lot of that is informed by the prior. So, but the atmospheric inversion is telling us that. We found, as there's been, at this point, there have been a couple papers showing that the total emissions in cities correlated with consumption, one in Boston and one in LA. And we found the same thing when we looked at natural gas consumption, shown here in red. We were able to plot the two against each other and look at the correlation coefficients. The R squared was about 0.52 and 0.42. So showing that a lot of the variability really is indeed explained by gas consumption, but not all of it, like only half. There is still a lot of variability between the different years outside of that, but there definitely seemed to be a correlation there. We also saw this decreasing trend that was pretty robust. And, you know, this actually came up to be about 4 or 5% per year. We tried to figure out why this would be, thinking about different data, but the natural gas consumption, which I showed does correlate. I'll show here, did also decline, but only about half of the decline could be attributed to the decreasing gas usage, and it was all within the error bars. Like when you work out the decline that could be attributed to natural gas usage, it could be anywhere between 0 and 100%. So there definitely seems to be something there, that less gas was being used because the weather has been warmer, but not all of it. So just overall, the findings were seasonal methane emissions. It's not super clear why they would be like that. Like I mentioned, in multiple cities, this has been found, but to different extents. Like in Los Angeles, they find much higher, like double emissions in winter than in summer, whereas we were only finding like 40% higher winter emissions. So not really clear what that could be, whether it's leakage within homes or buildings or et cetera. And then we found this decline, but again, it wasn't really clear what this decline is coming from. So that's definitely TBD work that we're hoping to continue. I mentioned earlier flasks, so I just want to give a shout out. These stars show the locations where we're measuring flasks with NOAA, and some of these other species can give a hint as to what's going on in terms of what sector the methane is coming from, because methane emitted from different processes has different co-emitted species that we can measure in the flask samples. So ethane and methane, for example, have been used in the past. On the right, I'm showing the flask data for a few years, ethane enhancements versus methane enhancements, and they do see that they do correlate, especially in the winter. But it's not that easy to get the fraction of emissions from natural gas from this, which is what has been done in the past. In our area, the fraction of ethane in the delivered gas is highly variable from day to day. So it's not always clear what we should be using for the pipeline gas. It's something that we're definitely working on and hoping to get more, like I mentioned, increase the flask sampling component so that we can get to this and possibly leverage other data. Like there have been other groups that have been measuring ethane with mobile labs that might help. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some other projects going on before we wrap up. One is the low-cost sensor network. My colleague Tyler Boyle has been working really hard for a couple of years, and on the left is shown a box with, we're working on CO2 right now, but he's actually worked really hard to get both the networking and the software as well as the hardware to be really flexible and able to accommodate any kind of sensor, so that in the future we can expand to other things. But he's also done some characterization of these commercial low-cost sensors to try to achieve sort of 1.5 to 2 ppm precision and accuracy across the network. The goal being to deploy, we actually have only deployed them on campus right now, but our goal is to deploy a couple more stations by this summer. This is an example of what he's done. He's made this really nice website. You can real time look at the data. They measure temperature, pressure, et cetera. So he has various for the infrastructure. And this is some of the results from his work, where he's done a linear regression with pressure and temperature to try to correct the data. So we've done some long-term testing where they deployed it alongside a CRDS Picaro analyzer, and, you know, like I mentioned on campus, that was the box that you saw earlier, and to look and see how we can improve the performance by doing different kinds of statistical fits and corrections. I know that's also something that's being done in Baltimore with different gases. A few other things I should mention. There's been a lot of work on transport measure, sort of running high resolution transport, looking at WRF LES and high resolution tracer modeling, kind of leveraging the aircraft data to evaluate things like turbulence downwind of New York City. There was a paper that just came out. There's a HALO wind LiDAR on the roof of the Department of Commerce building in downtown DC. We're also deploying a mini micropulse LiDAR at NIST for boundary layer height measurements. Again, I know that there's a lot of that going on in Baltimore for your project, so you know about these already, but you work with Ken, these eddy covariance towers that have been deployed to look at CO2 and methane fluxes in cities. We're working, actually, this is a new thing that with NOAA ARL, the Air Resources Lab in College Park, they're trying to do the inversion setup that I was showing before, both the one using the tower data. We're working with them to sort of develop a near real-time capability. They're the group that's the developers of the high split model. So they want to use that model and sort of all their experience making that model really sort of near real time and usable to develop a software package that can ingest all our observations and, within a month or two, spit out fluxes. So that's something that's in the works. Right now, they're working on CO2, but eventually that should also be for methane. We want to collaborate with you on the BSEC and the Courage project. And I mentioned earlier the SIF biosphere testbed that's been going on. That's another really active area of research. So this is kind of like some of the things I think about that we want to keep doing, which is we do have a problem with attribution. We're measuring total CO2 and total methane. So being able to understand the components in terms of the biospheric contribution for CO2 and in terms of the contribution, splitting out landfills from natural gas for methane, that we really aren't doing that great on right now. And we want to make more measurements in order to help out with that. So, again, I mentioned expanding the network. I think that's probably on hold a little bit beyond the few stations that we've got right now, although we do want to get one in Philadelphia. And again, this new real-time analysis system with NOAA. So we also want to be able to show value to stakeholders. We always say that. And yeah, consider more interagency collaboration. We're doing a lot of work with like the NASA JHG Center and the Greenhouse Gas Measurement Strategy from the White House and trying to understand, how urban networks fit into that kind of interagency monitoring framework that can go from a local to a national scale. Thank you. That's all I got.
Cool. Thanks, Anna. That was really great. I guess we've got like 20 minutes left, so we can open it up. If anyone got questions, feel free to go for it.
I had one I put in the chat, Anna. I didn't know if your low-cost sensors save any higher frequency information.
I mean, save is the key there, right?
Yeah.
I think it's still in development. So I think it could,
Okay.
if we thought, right now, he was planning on doing minute frequency, which you do mention there. And that's kind of what we do with the high at our towers as well. We publicly make hourly data available, but I have a version of the data that's 1 minute that we can distribute. So I could picture doing something with them, but if people think that even higher frequency would be useful, I'm sure that could be done. I'm not sure there's a plan for that right now.
We would love to experiment with it.
Yeah, I think the idea was with those sensors, the noise, you're trying to average out some of the noise, but so yeah, back and forth. For the CRDS, for the tower data, we could go higher than 1 minute, but that's actually kind of a pain for me logistically.
We could look at the lower cost sensors and see if it is noise or not.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to look at that. So yeah.
I had a question, Anna, about the results methane emissions in Baltimore. This
Yeah.
is something that I could probably figure out just staring at your plot a little bit harder, but the methane emissions have a seasonal cycle, but I assume that the relationship between gas use and I assume that it looks like that relationship's not like 1-to-1. So it's not like if you see a 10% increase in natural gas use, you see a 10% increase in emissions, that there's, there's a
Yeah,
some other kind of slope there.
I've sliced and diced this so many different ways. So I don't, you're saying percent, that's a whole different thing. But like, yeah, I mean, one thing is we found that like, if you look at the plots on the right, there's a very high intercept at 0, right? Like there's a lot of other stuff going on. And I just kept thinking back, like, if you increase usage, you increase emissions. That we see that at whatever slope that is, right? Definitely not a 1. And, it's some fraction. And if you look at what that is, it's like I think I said point, I can't believe I forgot this because it's kind of one of the main takeaways, but it was like a 0.6% or something, increase for every, so it's not really a leak rate. So some other studies, if you look at that slope and it's 0.6, or in our case, 0.006, right? So it would be like a 0.6%. I can't remember if it was the Boston study did that same slope and said, coincides with our total loss rate, because they got like 2.5% or something high. But that's not really true, because you could have some losses that don't correlate with use, right? Like your baseline, like my intercept doesn't mean that's all landfills. Like there could be leakage that happens no matter, that's not correlated with usage. It's just, that's what people mostly think, that pipelines probably leak all the time. You have losses from facilities, et cetera. So that's just kind of like the added amount after that is actually correlating with gas use, which is why when I tried to look at the trend, the slope down, like again, thinking about how much of that downward trend is due to reduced gas usage, I don't know what the baseline loss rate is. Like it could be that we're losing 2% plus another 0.6% for every amount you use, but that baseline 2% of gas being lost is kind of seasonally invariant. So it's not so straightforward, I guess is what I meant, because we don't know. I think that's the frustrating part, is like, we don't know what this is from. And if you don't know the process, it's really hard to tell like how much of the baseline was from natural gas versus landfills. We don't know that. I mean, in the paper, we try to estimate it by doing some spatial correlations with our inventory. But, that's, to me, that wasn't a super top-down result, because it depended on the inventory. It depended on where I had put those emissions to begin with in the prior and in the inventory. And so it's a little bit unsatisfying, I guess.
And Ken made a good point there in the chat. If the pipelines are always pressurized, there should always be some background loss, presumably.
Yeah, I've been trying
That
to
makes
figure
sense.
that out. I've heard anecdotally from different people that the pipelines are always pressurized, but then someone else said, well, no, they do sometimes pressurize them more in the winter because they're expecting more demand. So they need to, I've heard both, and not from legitimate sources that I can cite in a paper. It's definitely hearsay. So I think collaborating with someone from, and this is where maybe your group can, we've talked about this, collaborating with someone from BG&E, would be, I think, really helpful to get an answer to that question. Like, do they change the pressure in the pipelines at all? Is it change all the time? Can we get data from that? Like anything like that would, I think, be really useful.
Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure of what kind of information BGE has or can share, but it'd be interesting to chat more with them.
If I could just, one other thing that I kind of touched on a little bit is this methane ethane ratio issue. And I had it in a different talk, but I didn't put the slide. I should have it in my backup, but I don't. But the methane ethane ratio, I mentioned it changes constantly, but I'm not sure what it looks like spatially. So actually getting the composition information from BG&E, because Ken, I know you put in the chat the ethane issue. I think right now we can use ethane to say yes, no, like as a binary. This is definitely a landfill plume. This is definitely, but looking at the actual ratio, like they've done in Boston, trying to, and Jenny Plant did this with the aircraft data, that's fine because it's just one day, but this is again just something I found, but we did have an area sensor. Yeah, mobile sensors. I have an area sensor and we've had it outside at NIST on our campus for a long time. And there's a gas leak somewhere on campus and I'm getting these huge plumes that I can see. The ethane methane ratio in the plumes is like 5% or 6 or 7%. It's really, really, really high. And it's much higher than the gas line reports at the Transco station that I'm pulling every month. And again, anecdotally, I spoke with someone from the NIST Fire Division, and they said they had spoken with someone from Washington Gas that says that the local actually changes the composition of the gas and might add ethane because they have to maintain a certain energy content. So I don't know anymore what to believe, like in terms of the ethane methane content in the gas. I think we may need to measure it directly before we can assume something that we're downloading from the main portal, because the portal I've been using is from the company, the transmission company on the main transmission line and not the city gates. So again, if BG&E had an idea of what the gas composition was that they're actually delivering to Baltimore, because it could be coming from different places, it varies along the different transfer stations. If you look at the data, I found like it was a mess. And once I incorporated them all to try to get an uncertainty, I basically I could analyze my flash data and say, I basically have anywhere from like, 30% natural gas to 110% natural gas. Like that was literally my 1 sigma, uncertainty on that calculation. It was very frustrating. So yeah. So I'm seeing some stuff in the chat because now I have it pulled up.
Yeah, you have a volunteer to go make some source-based ethane methane.
I know. I think that would be great. We have, so I didn't mention, but Shinrong Ren and Phil Stratton from NOAA ARL have been driving a mobile lab, and they have an ARIS sensor as well as a Picaro, and they've driven around Baltimore and DC, and I've looked. So I need to kind of get with them to really understand that data, and I'm not sure what they're doing a couple of different things like with it. Because I think we'd want something a little bit statistical, like if you're randomly driving down the road, what percentage of the time are you seeing ethane and what percentage are you not? Or I feel like there might be some analysis you could do with that data.
This is Ben Knoll
from
This is Ben Knoll from Johns Hopkins and Pete DiCarlo's group, and we just got
Yeah.
a mobile laboratory, and we have a Picaro that does methane, ethane, so we're going to be doing similar type of experiments. But the nice thing about our methane, ethane, it's also a backpack, so when we see a methane spike, we can walk towards it and actually find where the sources are. And then we're talking with Scott and Ken about what type of experiments to do around Baltimore to try to better pinpoint methane leaks.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think another question that's related is whether in Europe they've seen, and in, was it Montreal, the paper on the sewer leaks, like that they think that the sewer system, so when you think about the spatial allocation of that, it's also along the roads. So we don't know, how much of that is natural gas leaks and how much is like, maybe there are sewer leaks that are happening in our cities that we don't know, but obviously the ethane data would tell us that pretty cleanly. Sorry, there was a question about the timeline. Yeah, we did. So actually, the issue with our network is we started it in late 2015, late 2016. We started our models. The problem is that we have wind flow from our area come from the Northwest, like a large percentage, more than 50% of the time. And our background station in the Northwest started in May of 2017. So all of my analysis starts May of 2017. We do have some data before that, but I didn't really trust what I was getting because I'd have to filter out so much of the data. We have a huge problem with the background upwind sources influencing our area, like Philadelphia and wetlands in the, that without a background station, I didn't analyze that. But I mentioned that near real-time system. I'm definitely looking at pulling it forward. So I'm working on getting 2022 out, to try to be able to be updating that because I know that that's valuable. So yeah.
But I think, Anna, this is a very broad audience. And a lot of times folks figure, don't we have data for all this time? But these greenhouse gas measurements are pretty rare and recent. Yeah,
I mean, I think that, and that could be true said for all cities, like I had that plot from Logan's paper kind of showing like the different urban networks and what they've done. Sorry, I didn't know so far back, but Salt Lake City's the main, anyway, the time axis is the same here on the lower right. I apparently cut it off on the lower left, but there was a network just for CO2 in Salt Lake City going way back. But you can see all these other networks started very recently. And for methane, you know, only these recent stations have methane at this kind of quality. So yeah, definitely not. And yeah, you can see how for Baltimore, it looks like the data starts in 2015, but like I said, we're kind of limited by this blue line, which is our background station, in terms of doing that specific analysis. Obviously, other things could be done with the older data.
Other questions for Anna about their work in the Baltimore DC area? Cool. Well, I guess if we don't have any other questions, we can wrap up the meeting for the day. But Anna, thanks for giving a talk to the group. I think most people like are aware of the work that NIST is doing, but it's fun to get an update because I don't think most folks know about the specifics of what you guys have been up to lately, and so it's neat to hear both about the recent papers that you guys have published and then also what your kind of upcoming plans are. So
thank you, and I look forward to seeing some of your, the results that come out of the BSEC project as well. Like that's really interesting to keep up with on our end, because I think we could probably leverage some similar data sets, like you mentioned, the backpack data. I think that could help us get to that. I think if you were measuring a plume directly coming from a gas pipe, then the relationship in the pipeline. So it would be great for you to be logging that, because it might be great to be able to compare that with BG&E or what we thought it was, and understand those compositions a little better. So thank you.
And maybe hopefully we'll be taking measurements that complement those from the NIST sites, whether those be from Pete and Ben's mobile lab or Ken's Eddy Flux sites. So yeah, I hope there's nice synergy between all the different data that all of us are collecting.
So can I jump in one more question? I want to cede to others who actually know this field better than I do, but I'm just curious, Anna. Ava Richardson from the city's Office of Sustainability is online for this call, and she's part of BSEC. And I was just wondering, and it sounds like you guys know each other, like how much is NIST working with getting this information to the municipalities and other decision makers involved, or if not, is that a role BSEC could help to play?
I think probably meeting, I have met Ava, but probably that's the only outreach. We've spoken with people from Montgomery County, Maryland. NIST is in Montgomery County, so there's a little bit of a tie in there. I think we're trying to figure out how to make it useful and to people like Ava and the city, because I think unfortunately we have these big uncertainty bars, and we can't, I think from the top-down measurements can't really pinpoint. Like you saw, it is frustrating. I have these methane emissions. I'm not even sure how much is from, I can estimate how much are from landfills, and I have some uncertainty bars, but, I think that stakeholders or, city managers probably want a little bit more granular information on like, are the landfills going down, or is the natural gas going down? What is changing? And we hope to be able to provide that. And I think this is where activity-based, like the bottom up information can help, a little bit, because at the end of the day, if you have a good activity model, maybe you can track activity and say, oh, that matches. Like the top down can give you a little bit more of a handle on what the totals are. I think that's kind of the thing, but we'd like to reach out to people, to people who could use our data. And if there's something we can do to make the data more useful that we don't know about, that would definitely be good to know.
Hey everyone, thanks Ben for highlighting that, and thanks Anna. I know we've corresponded via email, and I think there are some connections here. It's for a lot of local governments, we're doing our greenhouse gas inventories on a tri-annual basis, and so on those off years or those in between years when we don't have as great of data, maybe it is helpful to have some other data sources or other ways to conduct that analysis to understand year over year trends, even though that like the methodologies are very different from like the
Yeah.
ECLI protocol that Scott and Dylan followed for our previous greenhouse gas inventories. But I do think it's helpful to have ways to measure progress on years when we don't have the state's transportation data and what that looks like. But yeah, it is because I know Google, they've also excuse me, oh, can't stop. They have also shared some data with us in terms of emissions based on some of their satellite imaging, which is very different from the estimates that we have or from the data that we have for the triannual greenhouse gas emissions. And so, yeah, just with such different approaches, you get very different numbers and it's how we bring those processes together to create like better annual tracking is a good question, especially as we plan to see a lot of investments going into climate pollution reduction and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with some of the federal funding coming down. But yeah, I don't have any answers, just questions.
Yeah, I think we'll try to get some of this more, I say near real time, but I think the timely information, like you mentioned, being able to know that your emissions went down before that 3-year cycle occurs. That's something that right now weren't able to do, right? My study ended in 2021, but that's kind of why both of those are being kicked off. I mean, when I say both, I mean for carbon dioxide, as well as for methane. And in the case of carbon dioxide, like that lesson that emissions can be changing for any given reason, like the power plants, the gas use, whatever. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Like if we can see that variability from the top down. And I think we'll know more once we get like a long-term and, more near real-time systems set up for both methane and for CO2. Maybe, we'll come back with you and we can say, hey, this is what we got for 2022 and 2023. Does that seem to match what you think you should be getting? So that's kind of the goal there. I don't know what the Google from data is though. I mean, from data from Google is though, and I'm not sure if we might be able to help interpret why those are different. Scott, I don't know if you know more about what that is.
I don't, unless it's
their Environmental Insights Explorer. Are you familiar with that tool? Scott,
I've seen it. Yeah.
I just don't know how granular that data gets. They have I don't have the technical expertise to speak to like the source of the differences, but I think they don't have like the detailed transportation data or energy use data. They're using more I believe satellite data, but I don't want to misspeak.
I know also I think Google, I may be getting this right. I'm not sure if Google's working with the folks at Climate Trace.
Not sure if they're working, but if they I have no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I have seen this insights thing. I think if it's satellite data, it's like land use kind of data, right? Like it's not atmospheric data. Anyway, I'm kind of looking at it and I don't think it's related to Climate Trace either. I feel like there's a lot of people in this business now. And I think people like you, Ava, are probably like, there's probably a lot of different estimates coming from different sources that are trying to sell their product. And we're still trying to figure that out because actually on the NIST side, we feel like there's a role to play because we have this sort of role about with the commercial sector and standards, but it's not something we've done yet. But thinking about all the various private, nonprofit and for-profit companies selling GHG emission data, it's kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, I think for their tool, it was accessible via ECLI or cities who have membership through ECLI. So there was no additional cost to use, but yeah, I didn't find it super helpful for our needs, but yeah.
Yeah, and they do have this webpage about their methodology, but I think yeah. Incidentally, this is kind of more for Scott and Ken, but Lucy Hutira, who works in urban areas with the biosphere, she's doing like her sabbatical at Google this year. So she may be involved. She may know more about this.
In Mountain View, California?
I mean, I feel like she's actually remote. Like, I don't think
Okay.
she's actually there, but
Yeah.
I don't know what she's actually doing, but she's sort of someone else from our community, and I'm not entirely sure what she's using, what she's doing with them, and if it's at all related to this Insights Explorer thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ava, I think I see your comment. I don't think atmospheric data, I don't think they're not using like they're not doing what we're doing, like in terms of measuring CO2 in the atmosphere, this Insights Explorer. I think they are using the satellite data. To me, it looks like to get like building outlines and types of building and overhead imagery to estimate things like that, like underlying layer information. But it'd be interesting to get more, they may have more detail here. I'm just kind of glancing at their webpage right now.
Great. Well, thanks. I think speaks to some, well, hopefully some of the BSEC experts can help to play, right? Help communicate some of this stuff and compare. And we can also follow up with Lucy. She's already in touch with BSEC about the heat work she was doing with Google. So that'd be a good thing to follow up on.
Yeah, and it may be that she's not related to this at all. Maybe she's just.
She might know somebody who is. So
I don't
know. Yeah. All right. Well, and again, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And I'm sure you'll continue to be in close contact as all this work moves forward.
Thanks for having me, and I'll try to make your all hands meeting in June also, since I'm local.
That'd be great. All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.